Jim, we're good to go, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm so excited. Thank you all so much for coming. So many surprises. I'm just thrilled that you're here. I thank you, and I really want to thank Jim McHugh of P.I.T, and I'm very happy. I urge you to browse and to come back. I'm very happy to do this reading here. If you haven't gotten a chance to go to Jim's website, Property is Theft is what P.I.T stands for. I just want to tell you quickly in a brief version what his mission is, okay? It's to provide uncommodified community space and resources, to provide services like music lessons, instrument repair, martial arts classes, creative workshops, digital archiving, and cassette tape duplication at affordable rates, to provide access to revolutionary and rare music. He's got an incredible collection. And to literature libraries, and of course to function as a venue for performances, exhibits, film screenings, and readings. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to have met him because he's a rare breed this day and age. I feel like, and so anything. I also want to mention that you can do to support. There's a little sort of hat, cup there on Jim's desk. If you feel inclined to buy the book and or leave a donation for tonight to help support the space, that would be hugely appreciated by me. Okay. I also want to thank my publisher, the legendary Jim Fleming of Autonomedia. So Nick and I owned 15 Autonomedia books when I sent The Hill to Jim. So you can only imagine how thrilled I was when Jim said he would publish me, So I'm just very proud to be part of a stable of writers. So we've kind of structured the evening into 3 parts. An overview of the story with visuals, which I'm hoping I can manage PowerPoint here. The first part is by me, the second part is by Nick, and then a Q&A. I put out, if you want to sign our mailing list, most of you I know, so I will inundate you with our mailings whether you like it or not. But no, if you can, if you would like to subscribe to find, to keep updated, it's over there. And if you didn't get a postcard that I was passing out, I think you didn't get one, Nicholas, but but there's postcards over there that I want to make sure everybody gets. Oh yeah, and if you're interested to find out more, we did an extensive website of all of our work in the course of 42 years it's been now that Nick and I have been working together. And that's at thievestheater.org, theater with an RE.org. There's all kinds of info there, especially about The Hill, but beyond that. And one of the things that's there is Nick's autofiction, okay? Because my book is essentially my contemporaneous journal, but Nick spent more time on The Hill than I did. And he experienced things that I didn't, which he reconstructs from memory in his autofiction on the Thieves Theater website. So it's a whole different perspective, and it's a complement to my book. He essentially uses my journal to jog his memory, and then writes about what he, his own experiences on The Hill. Okay, I will start what did I miss here? Oh, right. I'll start the overview with a trailer, a video. It was produced by a Native American-owned LA production company called Untamed River Media and Productions, which has been very supportive of this Hill project. And Nick and I are going to be doing a podcast that is also coming soon. This is their website. So we're very excited about that, although, boy, is that a learning curve. So here, and for those of you who kind of got dragged here without having a clue what this is about, the Hill was a homeless encampment in the mid-'80s, and then we got there in 1990 at the foot of the Manhattan Bridge at Canal and Christie Streets. So, of course, the rest of the evening will tell you all about it, but just so you know, because, you know, when this, when I play this trailer.
The year was 1990. We had been doing site-specific alternative theater for about 10 years at that point. Our mission statement was to give voice to the disenfranchised.
Homelessness was rampant at the time. There were tent cities all over Manhattan, and the city had no idea how to deal with it. The longest existing encampment was colloquially called the Hill. It was at the foot of the Manhattan Bridge, in full view of the 80,000+ vehicles that passed over that bridge every day.
Most disturbing to us was how the rights of the homeless were being violated, especially the right against illegal search and seizure. The police were constantly tearing down other encampments.
That December was to be the centenary of the Wounded Knee Massacre. We wanted to commemorate that anniversary, so on Thanksgiving, with the permission of the residents, we erected a full-size replica of a Lakota teepee in the center of the hill. The teepee is more than just a shelter or a dwelling to the Plains Indians. It is a sacred hoop that holds the tribe together. And for the next 2.5 years, our teepee served just that purpose. Our neighbors almost instinctively embraced it as a drug and alcohol-free zone, one that they grew quite proud of and protective of.
The teepee made the invisible not just visible. It forced tens of thousands of passers-by each day to really look at these people, to think about how they got there, and to reckon with what they had built for themselves. An autonomous zone for those who refused to assimilate.
For a time, it was a stable, fairly content community, although there were always the sad exits of the dying. The early 90s was the height of the AIDS crisis, and many who used heroin had been sharing needles.
Still, there were also the many comical and farcical arguments and interactions. Yeah, every day a new belly laugh. Every day a little joy.
Over the 2+ years, the hill gradually got darker and darker. Drug dealers started taking control with impunity amidst the city's biggest police corruption scandal. There were knives and guns, there were fires, arson, and then murder. And that was the end of it.
Okay, so I'm going to be reading from my foreword, the foreword to the book, and followed by Nick, who, hey guys, do we have chairs?
Yeah, there's a couple chairs.
There's a couple chairs, okay, great. I keep touching. Okay. I'm going to read from the foreword from the book with commentary, basically. But I'm not going to read from the book, otherwise I'm going to have to, take notes and blah, blah, blah. So I'll try to distinguish between the commentary and the actual foreword. The foreword I begin it with a quote by Jean Genet from his novel, A Thief's Journal. And it goes, "If I examine my work, I now perceive in it, patiently pursued, a will to rehabilitate persons, objects, and feelings reputedly vile. I was involved in the rehabilitation of the ignoble." Nick and I met in 1980 doing a production of Jean Genet's The Balcony. We formed our theater company in 81 and called it Thieves Theater in honor of Genet. And that quote, maybe more than any other, guided us along the way. You'll see our mission statement later on, back when we were doing Thieves Theater, is heavily influenced by this quote, as is our work on the Hill. Here is our logo. Or I should say I keep going back and forth because we renamed Thieves Theater International Culture Lab in 2007. We formed this in 81, and in 2007 our focus changed. Thieves Theater was we were called during the time of the Hill. You can see the anarchist streak in that logo, which is why I put the anarchist symbol next to it. The circle with spikes came from Eric N., who a few of you in this room know. He was a playwright and a fellow Yale Drama School alumnus of mine, and later a co-artistic director of Thieves Theater for a time. And Eric is Catholic. We had all read Sartre's philosophical tome, Saint Genet, Actor and Martyr, but then Eric got a little bit carried away with the saint. So the circle with the spikes around it represents Saint Genesius, who was also martyred and tortured on a rack, which is what the spikes are supposed to be. Genesius was martyred in 281 AD when he was acting in an anti-Christian play and supposedly had an epiphany and converted to Christianity mid-play, which so enraged the emperor that he tortured and beheaded Genesius. So Saint Genesius, not Saint Genet, Sartre Saint Genet, Saint Genesius. So this is Eric riffing, he is the patron saint of actors, clowns, comedians, converts, dancers, people with epilepsy, musicians, printers, stenographers, victims of torture, and, wait for it, lawyers. Catholics, right? I was raised Catholic. Eric was writing his saint plays back then. He wrote a play for every day of the year because it has a saint attached to it, and so that's what that is all about. And so he contributed. His father was a graphic artist and created that logo for us. Back to the foreword. By the late 80s, homelessness was rampant in New York City. Tompkins Square Park and Bryant Park were tent cities, and shanty towns were everywhere. The oldest and most prominent one was at the foot of the Manhattan Bridge at Canal and Christie Streets. Roughly 85,000 vehicles a day passed this encampment known as the Hill as they traversed the bridge from Brooklyn to Manhattan, including my partner Nick Fracaro and I. As conceptual and theater artists, we were contemplating how to address the zeitgeist creatively. The theater was named in honor of Jean Genet, whose legend was that of an orphaned and welfare child turned petty thief, jailbird, homosexual prostitute and nomad, and who in the 1940s turned himself, with the help of Cocteau and Sartre, into an internationally respected author of 5 novels and 5 plays. In the 60s and 70s, Genet dedicated himself to backing the political aspirations of marginal groups, the Red Army faction, the Black Panthers, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. His posthumously published book, Prisoner of Love, which served as inspiration to Nick and me, is a meditation on his own life by way of the time that he spent with the PLO, and less extensively with the Black Panthers. So Prisoner of Love couldn't be published because of its topic in the United States. Nobody would publish it here. And so we use the book in various ways in our work, including for inspiration for The Hill. So we sent for 50 copies from England, which is where it was published, with the idea that we would distribute the book here. And it didn't quite work out that way, but we came up with very interesting uses for it, like a fake camcorder box scam. It's a really long story, but it's a very interesting story. It's in the book, or we can talk about it afterwards in the Q&A if you want to know what that was all about. All right, so back to the foreword. Obviously, Genet said in an interview in the early 80s, "I am drawn to peoples in revolt because I myself have the need to call the whole of society into question." And I love that quote. It also resonates, by the way, with anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, right? Whose cry of "property is theft," the name of this venue. Proudhon said about that phrase, "property is theft," the intention was to lodge a protest to highlight, so to speak, the inanity of our institutions. Or as Jim Fleming would say, the moronarchy of our institutions. Jim Fleming has a Facebook group called Moronarchy. Property is theft certainly also resonates with Native Americans, right? And over the 30 plus years since this work, we have progressed as far as that goes, a little bit at least, in acknowledging that theft. You'll often hear people these days say land of the Lenape before they talk about Manhattan, or so it's not like there's been no progress. But all right, so continuing from the forward, Thieves Theater first production was Genet's Death Watch, a collaboration with a drama group of inmates at Illinois State Penitentiary who called themselves the Con Artistes. After further study of the life and work of Genet, we eventually formulated an aesthetic, okay? To embody and articulate the voices of those who are stigmatized, quarantined, disenfranchised, to lift the barriers between us and them in order to find the common ground on which true community is dependent. Really lofty, okay? We were young. And I can feel Nick cringing. Yeah, he's turning the other way and looking out the window. We were very idealistic, obviously. But it does go a long way towards explaining why we did the Hill Project and why we did it anonymously for as long as possible. And you can also see how it relates back to the Genet quote about rehabilitating the ignoble. Okay, back to the foreword. One day, as we were crossing the Manhattan Bridge in our van, we saw what looked like a dead body near the hill. We tried to process what it was that we had seen. Could it have been? We talked about it, but we didn't stop. We kept driving. Surely somebody else would investigate. So, of course, the thing is we couldn't stop, right? You can't just pull over on the Manhattan Bridge as you're flying across it. There were no cell phones back then. You're not going to call 911 on your cell phone, right? And we drove over the Manhattan Bridge at least once a day because we had commercial plates. Nick he had 2 day jobs, but one of them was man with van, you know, moving services. And with commercial plates, you can't go over the Brooklyn Bridge. So we traversed that, and we saw that dead body in the middle of it. And at the end of it, every time we went over that bridge, there was the hill, there was the shantytown, for at least 5 years before we ever even put up the teepee. That's how long that shantytown existed, you know. You can see right here where the hill was at the stoplight. So, you know, the people would come off the bridge, and at the stoplight, there they would see 20 feet in, the teepee and the shantytown. So that's kind of what it looked like. All right, continuing from the forward, a later drive over the bridge confirmed that the body was clothes stuffed with tin cans and other detritus made to look human by an artist. But the experience, our lack of action, haunted us. That year, 1990, marked the 100th anniversary of the Wounded Knee Massacre. It was also the year that Dances with Wolves opened in theaters and was later hailed for reversing film's trend of negatively stereotyping Native Americans. The Plains Indians depicted in the film lived as a community, nomadically, in temporary shelters, right? Break from the forward. Trying to just, Nick said, you gotta make a distinction between when you're reading and when you're commenting. So we didn't know Dances with Wolves was opening that weekend. We may have been aware that it was happening, but again, this was not the age of the internet where everything was in your face all the time. You know, we may have read about it. But in any case, it didn't influence us. It was just a coincidence, but it was kind of amazing. You know, we put that TV up on Thanksgiving 1990, and that is the day that Dances with Wolves came out. So I also wanted to note, this is the arch over the Manhattan Bridge, right? And the frieze over the top, if you've never been aware of that, depicts a buffalo hunt, right? And that was just adjacent to the hill, a Plains Indian buffalo hunt. And the artist is Charles Rumsey, and the frieze, built in 1916, is in fact entitled Buffalo Hunt. And I don't know if you recognize this. It's behind the Brooklyn Museum. He also did that sculpture. It's called The Dying Indian. So, you know, the incongruity here, of course, is a frieze depicting Plains Indians buffalo hunt in the land of the Lenape. I don't know whose idea that was, but I do know whose idea it was to put up a teepee next to that, right? So this is called a court of honor, and it is modeled after the Porte Saint-Denis in Paris, which is that. So you can see very much that the Brooklyn Bridge arch was modeled after that, right? And sorry, I lost my place because I'm jumping ahead in my mind. Okay, yeah, right, all right. So, you know, apparently, everyone was so ashamed of the Williamsburg Bridge and the brutal functionality of it, and that was built 6 years before the Manhattan Bridge. So they kind of went all out with this neoclassical design of the Manhattan Bridge. All right, continuing with the forward. Nick decided to approach the residents about installing a replica of a Lakota teepee in the center of the hill and to live in it. I sewed the teepee, taking Reginald and Gladys Laubin's book, The Indian Teepee, as my guide. Instead of regular canvas, I used a patchwork of 78 U.S. domestic mail bags, opened and flattened into rectangles, intended as a reference to the canvas the U.S. government distributed to Indians to replace buffalo skins. So this is me making the teepee, laying out this patchwork of mailbags, making the teepee in the warehouse. 78 is also the number of cards in a tarot deck. And so by the way, the first thing I did was to begin illustrating the tarot deck on the mailbags. And, you know, like the 5 of Cups, the 3 of Swords, all of that. If you don't know what a tarot deck is, our modern day playing cards are based on tarot decks. There's 1 through, 10, and then the court cards, the kings and queens, called the court cards. So I was illustrating those, right? So here are some of them. And then later on, once we were already on the hill, I made the court cards, the kings and queens. I did portraits of the residents, and I brought some along. And this is us inside the teepee, and they hung as the lining inside the teepee. So the residents were always very proud to see themselves on larger than life inside the teepee. I was drawing those tarot cards, the minor arcana, these, the 1 through 10. And I thought, okay, well, I'll just keep drawing. And then our friend Valerie said, you guys, you're just procrastinating, okay? So regular mailbags together and put up your damn teepee, And we were like, okay, we'll do that. That could have gone on forever, me drawing those tarot cards, because I was then going to sew those illustrated cards together and make the teepee out of that. But it really was a way of procrastinating. We were much more excited about our other friend, Jared, who said, you don't really have to put up a teepee. You can just talk about it and say what the concept was, and that too is a work of art. So we were like, yoo-hoo! Because we were scared, obviously. It was like a mind-boggling endeavor. They think you're going to put up a teepee in a shanty town at the foot of the Manhattan Bridge. Okay, back to the forward. To erect the teepee required 17 pine trees, 25 feet tall, which we harvested from a friend's property in the Catskills. The trees needed to be straight and dead to keep their weight down. We were lucky to find a dense grove where the trees had shot up to find sunlight, but didn't survive. Dead sticks standing upright. With the help of friends, we felled them, carried them to the side of the road, loaded them to the roof of our van, and stuck a red flag on the teepee and hauled them to Manhattan. And the reason I'm pointing that out so precisely, okay, this is us finding them, cutting down the trees, taking them to the side of the road, putting them not on the roof of the van, as I've described, but in the back of the van. So they were sticking out like 15 feet with a bunch of flags on them. And then we drove in a caravan of somebody in front of the van and somebody behind the van, like the 3 hours from the Catskills back to New York City. And unfortunately, I didn't unearth these photos until later on, when we were told that perhaps the Fales Library might archive the Hills material and perhaps some of Thieves Theater. So we went down in our basement and we thought, oh, we're not going to have this stuff soon. Let's just haul it all up. We haven't looked at it in 30, 40 years, and start, scanning and uploading it to a website. And that's when I found these pictures, which would have been great in the book, Jim. Sorry. Next edition, okay? And also the other thing is that, and this is a bad editor, which is, we didn't take them to the hill right away. We brought them to the warehouse that I was showing you, where I was drawing, because the trees needed to be debarked and they needed to be stored there until the day we were actually going to put up the thing. They had to be worked on, right? So I lied. Continuing. When we arrived at the Hill, the residents for the first time grasped the reality and enormity of our endeavor and changed their minds. Not today, they said. We need to think about it. And with that, our first attempt at erecting the teepee was aborted. That was All Saints' Day. Nick decided that we were going to put it up on All Saints' Day, which is Halloween, and the following day is All Souls' Day, and that it would come down then, because we were really convinced the cops would take one look at it and say, you know, and then it would have been up for one day, and that would have been great, because 80,000+ people were going to see it in that one day from the people crossing the bridge, and we took a bunch of pictures, and we had proof we put it up, right? Nick is very metaphysically driven. All saints, all souls. Back to the forward. As Nick's friendships on the Hill grew stronger, and he explained what we were trying to do, the idea began to intrigue them. So on Thanksgiving Eve, the structure went up and we moved in. About a month later, on December 29th, 1990, the centenary of the Wounded Knee Massacre, which is widely considered the symbolic end of the US war against the Indian nations, we held a dedication ceremony at the teepee. In remembrance of the lives lost in 1890 and to the preservation of sovereignty and dignity of all disenfranchised individuals a century later. With what the casual onlooker didn't understand, the inconvenient truth, is that residents on the Hill didn't consider themselves the homeless. They, like Nick and I, had choices. Most had family, friends, or other ties to mainstream communities. They weren't interested in the city shelter system or in anyone solving their problem. Some were alcohol and drug addicts who supported themselves through theft or begging. Some were entrepreneurs working hard all day at odd jobs or converting the city's ample discards into profit at flea markets. Some were ascetics who just wanted to be left alone. What is society, which has a bias towards conformity, to do with them? Do they have any rights if they don't have a mortgage or rent payments and are in public property? Should they be pitied, shunned, punished, admired as iconoclasts? And if art's job is to reveal and contextualize, what is its responsibility? And I'll get back to the responsibility question later. These were the questions at hand. Nick and I had a long history of making radical, socially engaged art supported by our day jobs. At the time, along with Man with Van, Nick managed the New York branch of a Hollywood photographic backdrop rental company, and I worked in the corporate finance department at Rothschild, Inc. Under Wilbur Ross, then known as the bankruptcy king, but later Trump's Secretary of Commerce. I would work for him for 22 years. Every night after my shift on the 52nd floor of Rockefeller Center, I left in a black car that dropped me off at the shantytown, where Nick and I would live for the next 2.5 years. The stark incongruity was not lost on the drivers, who asked without fail whether I was sure I wanted to get off here. This journal details our day-to-day lives as we navigated drug dealers. The Hill started as a tight-knit community where drugs had to be scored elsewhere. But eventually the drug dealers moved in, and that's when things got really dark relatively quickly. We navigated the height of the AIDS crisis and one of New York's largest ever police corruption scandals. Okay. Time out here. The face of that scandal was a guy named Michael Dowd, a cop named Michael Dowd of the 75th Precinct, which is, I believe, East New York. And if you guys ever want to see a mind-boggling documentary, watch the 7-5, it's called, after the 75th Precinct. This guy is completely unrepentant. It's jaw-dropping, the corruption, and anyway. And as you can see here, that corruption probe focused on focused on 10 precincts, right? And including the 5th in Chinatown, which is the one we were in. And part of the reason that the teepee was able to stay up for as long as it did is because nobody knew who we were. We stayed anonymous for a long time, and no one was in charge. The cops were out of control, and everybody knew it. And there was even a rumor going around for a while that we were the FBI. Like the FBI is going to put up a teepee to entrap cops, dirty cops. You know, it was insane. But that's why the teepee stayed up, because it was a free for all back in New York, in New York back then. There are lots of articles, including about the Hill. Shanty Dwellers Call Cops Abusive is about the Hill. Okay. Back to the forward. We also navigated city politics of the Dinkins era, elected to solve the homeless problem, and various media also. The Hill traces the step of how a shantytown went from the anonymity of waist-high huts hidden in the weeds to a tour bus, school group, and celebrity stop, from addicts and recluses just getting by to a drug supermarket, from a close-knit encampment to a crime scene that entangles everyone from drug dealers to users to cops to us, when one day tragedy struck. Mr. Lee, the most innocent resident on the Hill, was the unintended victim of an arson fire set by a rival drug dealer. Mr. Lee burned to death in his hut. So there were obviously lots of news articles about that fire. I just want to tell you a little bit about Mr. Lee, okay? Here he is. Everybody was on the Hill was incredibly proud of Mr. Lee, and everybody adored him. They would point out to anybody that wanted to listen that came up there, look at his hut, look at it. It's built without a single nail in it. It's all tied together. And he would sit on the roof and tie elaborate things, you know, up there. And he would write things on the outside. The Voice did an article, The Master Builder, after he died. You know, you could see all the Chinese characters on the outside of his hut, all tied on there. And whenever we got a translation, like one time I saw the Queen of Germany lives here, the Queen of France lives here. You know, but elaborate writing. And he left most mornings with. This is him sitting on the roof, and he left most mornings with a bag. And he could be found then later on in a nearby park, and then he would come back at the end of the day. And when he died, the bag revealed a bunch of handmade passports and wedding photos, and we don't know homemade passports. You know, somewhere along the line, Mr. Lee, his mind faltered. Right. He later on, the New Yorker did a story about the Hill, and an interpreter who spoke Cantonese said that he told them that he left China for Cuba, and then during the Cuban Revolution fled to the US, which is how he supposedly then ended up there. And this is from just one entry, because it gives you an idea about how beloved he was, you know. One entry of mine about Mr. Lee on May 1st, 91. It seems Sammy may have succeeded in hassling Mr. Lee off the Hill permanently. He hasn't been around. For some reason, Sammy is bugged by him expanding his hut all the time. Mr. Lee rather ingeniously unties things from the inside of his hut and ties them back to the outside. In reality, no one takes up more space on the Hill than Sammy and his junk, so I don't know what his problem is. Anyway, I miss Mr. Lee, and so does everyone else. Although he goes his own way, his mere presence represents a bit of stability, gentleness, and guilelessness in a mostly explosive and cunning environment. The latest thing written on his walls was, "Home to people of many nations." Okay, so back to the forward. After Mr. Lee's death, Jean Genet explaining the title of his book, Prisoner of Love. Gradually, my feelings changed. I was still charmed, but I wasn't convinced. I was attracted, but not blinded. I behaved like a prisoner of love. We grew to love our neighbors on the hill dearly. They became friends. We performed theater and made art together. This is us doing a play inside the teepee. We did Heiner Mueller's Despoiled Shore Medea material landscape with Argonauts that was complemented by our own texts about the history of the land, as well as personal stories. One of our actresses, our close friend Annie, was a 13th generation descendant of Pocahontas, and she was telling stories, so it was, an elaborate play. Back to the forward, we sought to remove the us-them dynamic by encouraging passers-by to visit the hill. Hey, what's up with the teepee? And to get to know the residents as the charming, complicated fellow citizens they were. Marginalized people were brought into a conversation instead of being ignored and isolated. Officials were confronted with vexing conundrums and sometimes pressed to take a stand. But mostly we got to know our newfound friends, many of whom spent their final days of life on the hill. The hill is an up-close and personal account of a temporary autonomous zone that, for better or for worse, bridged a divide partially. So, for better or for worse, I say, because we didn't do anything with this story for 30 years, right? And because after Mr. Lee died, this was no longer a project, an art project. Though we weren't responsible for the darkness, we were certainly a cog in the wheel that brought it about. And as I mentioned earlier, the question became, what is the responsibility of the artist? We can get very high-minded about what our job is to contextualize, but what is our responsibility? And that question haunted us, like, what if we hadn't put up the teepee ever and drawn attention to the hill? Before we came, they built their huts weed high, and Mr. Lee wasn't the only one who died. Most died of AIDS. Louis and Indian Jim, who were the alcoholics, or the last of what used to be called the Bowery bums, they died. Louis died violently also. He came up, and tons of articles were written about Louis. He was almost like a professional homeless. Everybody interviewed Louis. There's New York Times articles, and he came up floating on the East River one day. So yeah, it's no longer an art project. So you tuck it away, and you try to figure out what the hell it is that you did. And, I also wanted to mention again, yes, we called it a temporary autonomous zone. We were first introduced to Autonomedia in 1991, my publisher, and, because after we had put up the teepee, I don't know, about 6 months later or so, that's when Hakim Bey, also known as Peter Lamborn Wilson, came out with TAZ, the Temporary Autonomous Zone, Ontological Anarchy, Poetic Terrorism, which of course spoke to us. And TAZ seemed to define what it was that we were doing. And that was the beginning of our love affair with Autonomedia books. So this is what the hill looks like today. It's now called Forsyth Plaza. Back then it was called Manhattan Bridge Plaza. I talked about why we didn't do anything with it for 30 years, but why did we finally unearth it decades later? Because I finally figured out it's New York City history, right? That shantytown existed for 5 years. Before we got there, we were there for 3 years. The story needs to be told and remembered, and we're literally the only people who can tell it. Everything was in our basement. So now the book is published. The New York Public Library bought a copy. The book is available at Printed Matter and Amazon, and of course Autonomedia and P.I.T. Not yet at a bookstore near you. NYU Phil's library has said they offer to collect the archives, prompting us to scan and upload all the stuff to our thievestheater.org website. And there's a podcast in the works. So now it's out of our basement and out in the world, which is really where it should be. So I felt like I had a duty to make New York City be able to access this story if they wanted to, for students, for whatever. But if people wanted to research it, they should be able to find it. So I'm now going to bring up Nick, and he's going to read short excerpt from his addition to the foreword, just to give you a little historical context, okay? Because we did a lot of research about the geography of the area. We wanted the residents there to feel like they were part of something bigger, a part of Manhattan's history. So we did research going all the way back to Henry Hudson and how it was called the Hill. But that's what Nick is going to be reading a little bit now, and then we'll do a little Q&A, okay?
Let's see, where is it? So this part of the foreword, it's titled Some Historical Context. At the time the teepee was erected, the Hill was the oldest and most prominent of the shanty towns in the city, and was characterized in the newspaper articles in the same manner as the historical and geographical antecedent, the 5 Points, which was NYC's most notorious 19th century slum. But now, with the juxtaposition of the teepee, laden with its romantic notions of a lost native culture and lifestyle, all further reinforced that year by Kevin Costner's film Dances with Wolves, it became more difficult to characterize residents of the Hill as, quote unquote, living like animals. Although no institution, governmental or otherwise, had authorized the teepee's installation on what was New York State property, the project must have resembled some type of sanctioned program. Teachers brought their middle school and high school students up to meet Gabriele and me and the other shanty dwellers. Church groups brought teenagers carrying prepared meals, all in exchange for the story of the Hill. Gabriele and I told the story first. We'd congregate with our neighbors and visitors inside the teepee, surrounded by Gabriele's larger-than-life portraits of the shantytown residents. She had painted them with oil sticks on mail bags, and together they constituted both the insulating liner of the teepee walls and the court cards of her tarot deck. The kings and queens of the Hill enjoyed sitting around the fire, being watched over by portraits of themselves, displayed as though they were a tribe. Gradually, each of them began telling their own version of the tale to visitors, coloring the history with their own unique way. Part of the Hill or origin story went something like this. During that time, I had a day job, but Gabriele most often worked it. So I was at the Hill all day. And I spent my time, I grew up on a farm and hunting, fishing as a kid, teenager. And I always had this connection to the land. And of course in the city you don't have quite that connection, it's paved over. But there is, I always feel like you can feel something from it. So I would walk a mile radius around the Hill every day. And it was a hill. It's the highest point in lower Manhattan. So it was a hill. And I had time and I'd go to the research library up at Midtown. And I'd pull out the history books to look at what was there and the history of it. And of course, there is no definitive history of, 1600s, 1700s inside New York. But I picked the stuff that spoke to me, and I made that the history. And I must have Xeroxed the copies then and started telling the story from the Xerox copies of the history that I wrote. But here's how it went. In 1609, Henry Hudson reached the tip of Manhattan Island, and 28 canoes full of men, women, and children met him there and brought him ashore to meet the chief, who welcomed and fed him. Later, Hudson returned the hospitality by inviting the chief and others on board his ship and treating them to brandy. This is the first time these Indians encountered alcohol. They all got very drunk. Centuries later, the Delawares still had among their traditional ceremonies an enactment of the supernatural awe they felt at the sight of the great winged vessel, the grand welcoming dance, and a garbled account of the drinking incident. They said the name was Mannahataknik, meant the place where we all got drunk. These Indians that Hudson first encountered were probably Warpos. Until 200 years ago, the hill area was the northeast bank of a 46-acre freshwater pond called Kelchhook, or Collect Pond. It extended west down to Center Street and south almost to City Hall. The only historical evidence of an Indian village in southern Manhattan was found on the banks of this pond. Records show that Collect Pond was surrounded by some hills, and on one of these hills lived the Warpos. Warpos was either the name of the tribe, the village, or the chief. No one is sure. But it is likely that the infamous $24 sale of Manhattan was transacted with this tribe. Warpos has been translated as meaning, quote unquote, Little Hill. All through colonial times, drinking water came from Collect Pond, but the waste from the tanning and slaughterhouse industries operating along its banks eventually polluted it. Once the water was undrinkable, the pond became a dumping place for all kinds of garbage and began to stink and fester typhus and cholera. So the city built a canal to drain it, thus Canal Street. They filled Kelchhook by using the dirt from the surrounding hills, remnants of the Warpos. Then in 1836, the first jail in the city was built on the site. It's got its name, the Tombs, from its Egyptian architecture. Later it was torn down and rebuilt again, minus the Egyptian architecture, but it was still called the Tombs. Today, central booking at 100 Center Street is being rebuilt again, but is still called the Tombs. If you go down in the area now, this is at the time we were there. If you go down in the area now, you can see nearby 3 separate fenced-in archaeological digs going on. The African burial ground, the notorious 5 Point Slum, and a Native American site. Whoever was speaking here would have colored this section of the Hill story with their own experiences at the Tombs. Most of the storytellers had been, quote unquote, put through the system of central booking more than once. And for all the residents, the literal tombs lurked just as near as the jailhouse tombs. Violence in both its overt and subtle forms was a constant presence on the Hill. Ambitious and aggressive drug dealers, each with their posse, warred with one another over who would be most feared and control the trade. But none could match the posse of diseases and the grim efficiency with which they kept the population in flux. Emergency medical technicians wouldn't enter the shantytown. The sick or wounded had to be carried to the parked ambulances on the street. A multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis had become epidemic in New York City in the early 90s. Spread in tiny droplets through the air, TB is most potent in such places as unventilated shanties and homeless shelters. But mostly those living with HIV, AIDS, and its complications spent their last days on the Hill. On August 17th, 1793, bulldozers pushed the Hill and its story into some collect pond of buried memories. And perhaps it is more providence than coincidence that 8 years later, on September 11th, many of the archaeological artifacts from the African American burial ground and from the 5 Points stored at the World Trade Center were buried and lost again. the Twin Towers were both the actual and symbolic backdrop of the quote-unquote teepee in the shanty town. Polar opposites and fandom icons of the battlefield that was and is Collect Pond. Right. That's
Thank
the
you.
reading. Thanks.
I don't know if anybody has any questions. Or not.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Did you live there? You did for the 2 years, so you slept there and everything?
Yeah, the first year I slept there every night, and I was there most of the day because Gabi was taking my day job. We kept our apartment, so we would go home at times and shower and have a meal. But yeah, we spent every night there, and I was usually there during the day. Gabi was there a lot of the time during the day, and she slept there at night.
At night,
yeah, she had the job from 6 to 10.
Yeah.
And so at 10 o'clock she'd come down with the black car and get off and go to sleep.
I worked at that investment bank, like in their, not their mailroom, but doing presentations and word processing and stuff like that, so I would get there late in the evening. But yeah, as we kind of mentioned, most of the people had affiliations. There were a few who were what we think of as homeless, but really homelessness is a completely imprecise term in so many ways. It's kind of a catch-all that encompasses all kinds of problems, from a housing shortage to, family problems, drug addiction, all kinds of things. And the people there, two of them that I can think of had no affiliations that we know of, because they were both the Chinese, Mr. Lee and whatever, they were likely just living there, but they first of all might have had, Chinese community tends to be very close-knit, they might have had affiliations, but everybody else did. They had ex-wives, mothers, whatever that they stayed with and would go back and forth to the hill like we did, so it's not, yeah.
The portraits are so beautiful. I'm glad that you brought some of the actual mail bags with portraits here so that we
Thank
could
you.
see them. I mean, they're great in the book, but they're just lovely. And they were such a unifying presence between you two and the rest of the community there. But I wonder, I don't know why you chose to do the tarot cards before that. I couldn't tell from the book.
Yeah, it's just the whole thing for me was an exploration of metaphysics, so I was testing divining, and I did it when I got back, when I was up on the hill too. I read the landscape and what have. It was interesting, an artist, Mel Chen, who does land art. He came there and visited one time, and he talked to the Chinese man that was living on the slope of the hill. He had built his hut underground. It was an amazing structure. Nobody had ever been inside, but it was probably as big as the center room here, where he had dug a hole into the slope and lived under there, and there was little air things above, and I used to talk with him in a strange way, and he would put things out for me to see, and then I'd look and da. But Mel Chen came. Mel Chen talked to him, and he said he was a geomancer. And geomancer, I didn't know quite what that was. And then I started studying it, and it's divining through the earth, well, anyway, for me, yeah, the tarot deck was that. I was reading the tarot all the time and using it, and and we were making a teepee, and I don't know.
And what really blew my mind is that it actually took, I used that book by Gladys and Reginald Loudon, The Indian Teepee, and it took 78
It took 78 bags. How does that work? So that's the
that doesn't
metaphysics.
turn you into a believer after that.
But if you look at these portraits, they're interesting in the sense that ones we chose tonight. There's Mr. Lee over there, and he's standing on top of this thing. You'll see him later. But and people we knew, the brothers here, they were running the hill when we first came up there. And they were, you can tell, they're sort of jailhouse guys, from Jersey. And they all had AIDS. And they were sort of running the place then, The hill was sort of, when we got there, it's interesting because it's sort of based on the way, if you ever been to jail, you see it. It gets broken down in racial kind of, different kind of ways like that. So the racial element started entering into it. Red was always there. He was a middle class kind of Jersey kid that got hooked on heroin, and but now you got Ace and Sammy. Sammy, Puerto Rican, very hard-working guy.
Entrepreneur,
Yeah, very, always scrapping and finding stuff and selling them in flea markets. And Ace, well, he was a heroin addict too, but a poet too.
Poet.
Yeah, we were always looking for a typewriter for him. We never found it. And but then Sammy, and then Elaine, she was one. The women up there were, prostitutes, or some of them who weren't prostitutes had other ways to make money. They could steal meat, go into the grocery store and put meat into their.
But they were controlled by the men up there.
Well, yeah, mostly controlled by the men.
Yeah.
Now we get to these people, that's Robin and Spencer, and up there is Panama, or Tony and his dog. They look like sweet people, but they were the drug dealers that moved in. And
like, what do you do with them, when they come up to you and like Spencer, right, says he considered himself a doctor, right?
He's giving medicine to people who need drugs, and he says if anybody wants to get off drugs, I'm going to send them to the.
I'll help them.
I'll help.
But I'm going to take care of them. They'll get the drugs from me because I provide clean drugs that aren't cut.
And
right?
we're in the middle of it, and it's a complete. The cops are in on it. Cops aren't going to bust him. Cops aren't going to do anything.
And then he would have, big barbecues where he fed everybody and contributed to the community, But as soon as these guys came on the hill and selling was starting to be allowed on the hill, that's when everything went south, But then they're asking me to do their portraits. They're very sweet people. I went to her baby shower in East New York, It's like, but that's what I'm talking about. You're slip sliding into complicity, Where are you going to draw the line? And if you're going to draw the line, how are you going to draw the line, right? Because you can't stop everybody else from doing it either. Suddenly they were like, oh, cool, I don't have to go off the hill to score my drugs. I can just go next door, but that was the beginning and the end. And that fire was set by a rival drug dealer who was targeting somebody else, and Mr. Lee, was the victim. But it was, it just was.
So when you say, it created like a family, what kind of family?
But it's like everybody else. Even when you get to know people, that's the whole thing. Mm-hmm. They're just people. Like the guy who did I'll get to your question in 1 second. The guy who did the New Yorker article, he came up, Jim Lardner is his name, grandson of Ring Lardner, if you know that name, author, right? He wanted to, and we didn't, he overheard Nick and me talking on payphones, and then he approached Nick. whether he could do an article, and we thought, because we did not let press up, we did not tell anybody who we were for a long time, right? But he wanted to do, it was the New Yorker, you know, which has a reputation of being, you know, fact-checking and being the New Yorker, right? So we said, okay, fine, we'll give you access, but you have to promise to spend at least 6 weeks. He ended up spending 6 months. And at the end of those 6 months, he forgot what it was that he wanted to write in that article. And you know why? Because they ended up just being people. People are people. They're not that interesting, you know? I mean, before that, you can romanticize what the homeless on this shanty town are like, you know, and surely there's, but it's just, you know, they're fighting with their girlfriends and they're, you know, I don't know, whatever, but yeah.
Yeah, I just had a question at the end when things kind of went bad. Do you have a memory of when you guys took the TP down? Like how did that all end, or no? Did it you just left it and just got like?
No, you know what we eventually did. I don't have a picture of it, but we took the original TP down and we left for a while. We did a whole road trip, and then came back and we took the cover down, and then we got a second wind and we made a brand new cover that somebody designed for us. You can later look at the rug. I made a rug out of it later, and that was the design of the second teepee, because suddenly people started getting into it. We had this guy who owned a canvas shop. He says, you gotta make tons of teepees, like little ones, and put them on street corners everywhere in Manhattan. We'll make a whole project out of it. But you're gonna make another teepee out of canvas, and it was a vinyl lined canvas. So we spent all this time and work, you imagine, on this teepee. It's big, right? Making that design and painting it, you know, in somebody's basement, whatever, and putting it up. And that teepee was up for about a month, and there was a fire, another fire, tons of fires on the hill all the time, right? Because they would steal, I'll just tell this quickly, they would steal electricity from the lampposts and plug in their TVs, you know, plug in their space heaters. But periodically the city came and cut that off, right? You can't be siphoning electricity from lampposts. But every time they did that, there were fires on the hill because these people had to stay warm somehow. So they would burn wood and stuff in barrels, and then take the what do you call it? Not the ashes, the coal. Thank you. The coals inside their hut, right? So it was stupid. It works much better if you can siphon electricity from the lampposts, and you know. But I do this all the time. I went off on a tangent and then forgot.
No, yeah. What happened was we had put up. I don't even think it stayed a month. Put the canvas up. And this was because in the fire with
right,
Mr.
The fire, right. Then what happened was that brand new teepee, because it was vinyl lined, got so hot inside from that fire that one of the people who saw it said it suddenly just went poof and disappeared. It didn't even go up in flames. It just disintegrated, you know. And then we never really, go ahead, we never put the teepee back up.
No, because when Mr. Lee died, the teepee got burnt and singed and everything else, and we weren't going to go back with it, right?
No, and that's when we didn't live on the hill anymore.
We didn't live up there anymore. But we made the memorial kind of cover out of the canvas and put it up, and then it
that's a memorial to Mr. Lee, including the whole Streets Blossom where you.
And then after that, we just left, you know,
and left the sticks.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the poles stood up for a long time, for quite a while.
And then we were watching it on the news how the bulldozers came.
Oh, you watched it.
And bulldozed the teepee sticks. You know, along with all the shanties, it finally came down, but it took 3 years, and everybody kept saying, you know, Tompkins Square Park is on, you're next, you know, and we were never next. The hill was never next. Like I said, 8 years at least total that shantytown existed. Can you imagine today anybody allowing that? I mean, you know, Adams is out right now clearing all homeless encampments, you know, tents, never mind structures. Yeah.
Who did they think you were? Like, Did you guys go in there like reporters or?
No. Who the
Like,
residents?
were you guys undercover?
Who are you talking about? The residents? Or?
Yeah, when you were living at the hill, were they thinking you were?
Not the outside people. You mean who the residents
Yeah,
thought
the
we
residents,
were?
yeah.
They knew who we were because
they did.
yeah. Nick hung out for at least 6 weeks, getting to know them, and
then we started doing projects with them. We had a lot of different projects.
Lot of
with
projects
with them.
Yeah.
You know, you know, you can imagine people going by taking pictures of you, right? Like you're in a zoo,
Yeah.
right? And they just hated that. So they would throw rocks at the people, you know, get the fuck out of here, you know? They'd throw rocks at the people taking photographs. And we came up with the idea, what we should do is, we got this from a Plains Indian counting coup, if you ever heard of it. In other words, you're more brave if you go up to your enemy and tap them instead of killing them, you know. And so they would count coup. And so we went out, and back then they had these
disposable cameras.
disposable cameras. I think you could buy them for about $10, and they'd have 24 photos in them. And we passed them out to the residents, and we made the game that you would go up, when you see somebody taking a picture of the hill, go up, sneak up next to them, and surprise them, and take their picture. And in the act of taking a picture. So we had them do that, and then we'd develop the pictures, and we'd hang them as on the what we called the scalp pole out in front of the teepee. So we had all the pictures of the people that they caught, and so you know they could see the people.
And then they developed the technique where they would you know you can tell when people are about to sneak a photo, right? You can see it a mile away, and they would go up to the people and take a picture of them taking a picture, and then go hello, and so there were a bunch of pictures like this. So they really love this better than throwing rocks. You know?
So that was like one project we did, but we did other projects with them, and
Yeah, so they knew who we were. You know, Nick hung out for 6 weeks getting to know them before we ever put up the teepee. You know, as I was saying, when they finally saw 25-foot long trees, they said, I don't think so, not today, right? But then eventually they grew to like the idea, and we all became great friends, you know, including, I mean, we weren't friends with the drug dealers, but they were very friendly people, and you know, like these sort of jailhouse looking guys, these 4 brothers, they were the funniest damn people. All 4 of them were hilarious, and you know, just charming as hell. And they were hardcore, you know, but they were very sweet, very heartwarming people, you know, and you got to know them. And all I kept thinking of was their mother, right? Can you imagine having 4 kids HIV positive? You know, there was no medicine back then, you know. So,
that's why the EMT people wouldn't come in, because there were so many. Even in medicine, you know, even they didn't know. Well, they did know, and they knew that there were needles all over the place because there were all heroin addicts up there. So they didn't want to step into the compound. They wanted whoever was sick brought out to them on the sidewalk.
Can I just sort of tag on to that? Because his question is sort of what mine was as well, is you know, what sense did you have of how the residents perceived you guys, especially when you arrived? Did they think you were there to help them? Did they think you were there because you were drug addicts as well? Were they looking for city services? Did they want to be helped?
No, I mean, here's the thing, okay? No, they were not looking for city services, because then, like now, shelters were hell. They were more dangerous than anything else. That's why they can't get people to, you know, go into shelters that would rather fend for themselves on the street, right? And you mentioned something before.
Did they think you were there to help them?
Oh yeah, no. They knew we were artists, you know. And like I said, I mean, Ace like Nick said, he was a poet. He won, in prison poetry contests, and he wanted to be a writer, and Red was typical sort of middle class. I remember his heartwarming thing is that his mother still had newspaper clippings of when he was a basketball star in high school, and one clipping was all about how they never had another great player in that high school since Red, and he clung on to that, and he told anybody who wanted to listen that. So he was just a middle class kid, and they're not uneducated or unintelligent, or do you know what I mean? We had amazing conversations on the Hill. And I know what I was going to mention. No, they accepted the Hill immediately as a drug and alcohol free zone.
Yeah.
It was a church. And we made it that immediately, and we dealt with a lot of Native Americans also, right, who were some for, some against what we were doing, some supported us. AIM came up, that's a whole long story that Nick writes about in his autofiction. But they certainly weren't, it was complicated, but we made sure that everybody knew that. And they loved it, see? They loved going in the teepee, sitting around the fire, and having that reprieve from the outside world, because it was a whole different world in there. It's beautiful being inside a teepee, at night especially with the fire. Sammy said that when the fire was raging in the teepee, you could see it all the way from Canal Street,
From Houston.
Houston, sorry, so I'm from Houston, because it slopes up, and so they were really proud of it, and they knew, and they kept an eye on it. They if anybody was going to disrespect it, they would nip that in the bud immediately. One time, Nick and I took a road trip in the middle of it all to research the Wounded Knee Massacre and to go to Pine Bridge Reservation, which, by the way, it was the first time I was introduced to the idea of how Native Americans actually have to live in the richest nation in the world. I had no idea that the level of poverty is just, and also I didn't have an idea until then how, the Indian nations aren't some bygone history that you see in Hollywood movies. They're now, there's a whole culture in all of these hundreds of tribes now, as languages are getting lost, but the abject poverty of these reservations is, that there's no sense of national shame on this is, I was so naive. But when we went on that road trip and came back, they were so proud. We didn't let anybody go inside. No drug and alcohol. If anybody, they were so proud that they took care of it. And there was not a hair out of place inside that teepee in the entire time we were gone, So it was beautiful, actually. It was a very beautiful experience. Yeah, and if anybody wants to leave, I don't want to keep people here, I don't know, maybe we should break it up and talk individually or something. Maybe one more question?
I'm looking at the photo on the sidewalk, and that's like the bike ramp that goes up to today.
Yeah.
It's the ramp that goes up to the bike path up on the bridge, and you can bike through that, and it's actually quite a beautiful little landscaping they do. What do you think when you go through there today? When you look at it?
Well, we, for one thing, we've thought of, and we don't know how to do it. We did a proposal to Creative Time.
There you go, right?
Yeah.
We did a proposal to Creative Time. Okay, so again, buried again. The whole history is just buried. When they put this plaza up, back when the Manhattan Bridge was built, they had to displace, I think, 1,000 families when they put it up, But now, of course, this is just now, this is where these people were living, but more importantly, this is where, Mr. Lee died. We've been trying to get a memorial.
We'd love to have a memorial there, There should be a memorial to not just Mr. Lee, but the Hill,
The proposal we put in was telling the whole history of the Hill. The Hill being the war post place when it was called Little Hill, the village that was, you know, pre-history, pre-white man history.
There's also Bayard's tomb, right?
Yeah, it was Bayard's Mount during the Revolution. Bayard got there, he had a tomb under there. There was a rag man who lived inside that tomb for a while, you know, in 1800.
And by the way, the teepee still exists too. We're trying to find a museum or someplace to take the teepee. The Museum of the City of New York, the cover, kept for a year. Well, we don't know. Is it activism? Is it art? Is it history? What is it?
But after it was over, after they plowed it over, we snuck over the fence they put up, and we planted a Christmas tree, and a tree, pine tree, and it lived there for a while. We put it right where Mr. Lee's hut was at, and it's haunted us. This story, I guess it's a story. This time in our life has haunted us. Mr. Lee and I used to we had a snapping turtle. And we put it in a pond there between me and Mr. Lee. Between me, I say, because I come out every morning before we leave, and we talk about the turtle, and we feed the turtle, and then he'd go his way, and I go mine, and now every place we go, we collect turtles, so our house is full of like turtles, just to.
And they used to have a conversation because Mr. Lee, of course, coming from Cuba, also spoke Spanish, and they used to have a turtle conversation, and Nick would say, "It's Tortuga de Luna," and Mr. Lee would go, "No, it's Tortuga del Sol," right? And that's what this design is about. This that was what the second teepee looked like. I later made a rug out of it,
a rug out of the clothes we were wearing.
The clothes we were wearing on the hill. Tortuga del Luna and del Sol, and there's a turtle swimming on the bottom, and Nick came up with a streets blossom where you roam until timeless spring, now golden winds unfold. So it was in honor of Mr. Lee, but yeah, that's the one that went poof up into flames after we made it.
But I mean it's interesting because the turtle has no enemy in the wild world. You think of it, there's no predator that can get the turtle except the eagle, right? And the eagle will go down and grab the turtle by its tail, carry it up, and then drop it on rock, it'll crack open. So the eagle is the only thing. And after Mr. Lee had died, it was strange because it was frozen. The water had frozen over, and Gabriele had said we had gone on a trip. The water of the pond had frozen over, and so there was no turtle. We thought he was dead, because the aerator that I had hooked up had stopped when we were gone. So it was frozen. And then Mr. Lee had died, but then the spring, a few days later, about 3 days later, the ice started to melt, and the turtle came up. It had been hibernating, right? And so there was the turtle, and we were.
I don't like really talking about it.
Yeah, but we,
because we mistreated that turtle.
Well, okay, come on.
It's true.
Okay, stop it.
We set
no,
it,
I did.
We set it loose in Prospect
So
Park
then
after
then I took the turtle, and I put it into a milk cake.
I'm vegan now, okay?
And I took it, and I went to the. I went to Prospect Park Pond, and I set him free there. I took the subway over there and took him free, and then a couple days later, I was under a psychological thing going on with me then too, because of all the pressure from the district attorney and stuff investigating it and sending really nasty kind of shit he was doing. He was calling all my friends, my work and everything, hassling, and over to the investigating the arson. And I had a vision, and there it was. It was the eagle going down and picking up the turtle to lift him up to kill him. but the turtle held on to the earth, and the earth moved with the turtle. It moved, and there was no time there. There was no time anymore, because the turtle held strong as the eagle was pulling, and the two of them were making time meaningless. And I don't know, I had some solace with that. But we've been collecting turtles ever since. So we have turtles all over our house. Remember.
So thank you guys. We can, we'll stick around and we can continue talking. I just want to release you.
Thanks for
Thank you so much. And if you can spare in your heart a donation to P.I.T, I would appreciate it. Just to support this incredible space.
And he has copies of the book for sale?
We have copies of the book for sale, yes. I'll sign them.